Hello, everybody. Greetings from London. Super excited for our call today. We're here with Joseph Luzzi. Joseph, how are you today?
I'm great. Happy to be here.
So glad to have you. So we're about to have an invaluable conversation on key decision-making strategies from history's tipping point. So all of us, no matter whether it's our professional life, our personal life, causes that we care about, we constantly need to make. So before we get started, Joseph, I'd love to ask you, what got you interested in this particular topic?
Sure.
And then we'll go and dive into the tipping points from right there.
Great, thank you. It's a great question because it's really tied to the content that I've developed working with people in business, and it's come out of my career I'm a professor of comparative literature and also a writer. And I have a strong background in Italian studies. So you might ask, how did I get to here working on history's tipping points? I had always wanted to, I always felt I had an entrepreneurial streak, and I had always wanted to be a writer. When I became, and I love being a professor, and I've been teaching now, I got my PhD in 2000, so I've been full-time academic for 2 decades. And I love that. When I got to the point where I had, long-term job security and I had tenure and I had written one scholarly book and I had another one on the way, I made the decision to try and write more popular work to kind of spread the message more. And that was really life-changing because it brought me into contact with all kinds of readers that I hadn't really dealt with before when I was writing more in a scholarly context. And one thing led to another. I started doing more speaking related to my books, kind of speaking with broader audiences. And then, IVY actually was an organization that had asked me to talk about what are some lessons we can take from these great thinkers. And I gave a talk for you on life lessons from Dante and Machiavelli. And around that time, I started thinking I would develop this more because the response from entrepreneurs was incredible. Like, I realized writers and entrepreneurs have a lot in common. We both have to create something out of nothing, right? And the kind of feedback that I started to get was inspiring. And then The Economist came out with an article saying that we should rethink corporate education, that the idea of just trust games and some of the more externally driven things could be replaced by working with the great thinkers. Like, read the great books with someone who understands them. Test your own ideas with the greatest thinkers of history and see how that can bring value to your business. And so I started to kind of do more in that regard and speak with businesses about the power of literature, philosophy, history for leadership, decision-making, creativity, and innovation. And I really came to see that history has basically test cases that, like you have in business, where you have a situation with an incredibly complicated, intricate, seemingly no-win decision to be made. How do you negotiate that? Businesses have lots of money on the line, but leaders often have lives on the line, the destiny of an entire nation, right? The course of history. Why, when Abraham Lincoln decided to end slavery, we were precipitated into a civil war. The United States may have become split as a result. When Caesar decides to cross the Rubicon, he knows it will mean civil war, and he knows there's no turning back, and at the end of the Roman Republic, he's trying to bring that to an end, that there'll be no going back to the former way of government. Kennedy, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were facing nuclear Armageddon. The world could have been destroyed. I realized these are incredible things for business leaders to learn from, because the stakes that we always talk about, money creating stakes, and it's true, people's jobs are on the line. But here, the stakes are even exponentially larger. So I started to realize there was an enormous value for business thinkers, business leaders, young people at the start of their careers developing their, business vision, mid-career people in corporations or entrepreneurs trying to stake out the next stage of their lives, or then people in the C-suite, the CEOs have time to take a step back and develop a broader vision. All these could benefit from studying, the great tipping points.
I love that. For me personally, what inspired me to do a lot of what I do was always based on a real love of history. I've always been incredibly fascinated by these historical figures, great men and women who, many of whom you'd never have bet on if like based on their upbringing and background. And then they ended up doing these things that helped change the whole world. And, you know, a lot of times truth is much stranger than fiction.
Absolutely.
Like you said, the stakes are so high. So like I said at the beginning, I can't imagine a better way to learn better decision-making strategies than to actually look at some of the most historically game-changing decisions that were ever made in the history of the world. With that in mind, what's the first tipping point that you think we should consider when we're looking to up our game when it comes to decision-making?
Well, you know, before I get to that, just a 1-minute parenthesis, because I think it's really important. I think there's two stereotypes today that we have to fight against that make looking to history in the past so important. One, you know, we are obsessed with technology. We're obsessed with all that's happening in the present. As you said, there's so many amazing models in the past, and that's a great resource for us. And two, leaders come in all kinds. There's charismatic leaders, there's quiet leaders, there's cerebral leaders, there's, you know, more physically active ones. There really is no prototype for what makes a great leader. And I found that in all my work, because the difference between these all, there's room for everyone. And I think, as I always, as you know, not everyone is a manager, and that not everyone has people working under him or her, but everyone has to make leadership decisions in their personal and professional lives. So the first one that I like to talk about is going back to Caesar. You know, it's so famous, crossing the Rubicon. That's an expression everyone understands, everyone realizes. What does it mean to cross the Rubicon? It's linked to this idea of the other phrase connected with the die is cast. In other words, there's no turning back. I love this because the word decision in its root in Latin goes back to this idea of kind of making a cut, right? You have to, a good leader can never be indecisive. It has to be decisive and take all the risk and responsibility that entails. And I use the example of Caesar crossing the Rubicon because I think it teaches three very important things. One, you know, we have this kind of binary approach to decision making. We think, you know, there's this wonderful book that I urge all of you to read called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's you know, revelatory about how bound we are to our biases, our prejudices, our kind of intuitions that can sometimes hamper us from statistical thinking, rational thinking, to kind of think of things clearly. But I think there's also a third way. There's intuition, there's analysis, and then there's the perfect fusion of the two. When we've done something for so long, we can kind of combine a rational understanding and trust our intuitions. And I think that's what Caesar does. When he decides to cross the Rubicon, if you read the kind of the historical record, he does it because he sees a kind of omen of like a young boy playing a flute. And he takes this as a sign that he should kind of make the most momentous decision in Roman history. And you're thinking, wow, why are you basing it on that? I think that's only part of it, because I think if you take a step back, what Caesar did was he had spent his whole life as a military leader. You know, he had spent his whole life. He was the first into battle. That's why his soldiers loved him. He was an incredible ruler. He knew, he sensed that this sign tapped into his intuition, that in the kind of computer of his brain, the rational thinking and the intuitive thinking came into one. And once he got that sign, here's what I think is important. He acted on it decisively. There was no turning back. Famously, he burned his ships, right? Like, you can't turn back if you burn your ships. And so I think the one thing that a great decision maker has to do is completely be willing to have that burn your ship moment where you're not turning back. You're going to see this through. Because the astonishing thing about Caesar's subsequent victory, it's not the decision so much, it's the strategy that he put in place afterwards. Unlike his rivals, once he crossed the Rubicon, he had a clear plan for success. And, you know, I think he said of Pompey, his rival, he knew how to win battles but not wars, something like that. And I think that Caesar knew how to win a war, right? He kind of made the decision and then had a very elaborate, intricate strategy in place, which he executed. So what I see the Caesar case is three things. One, the fusion of intuition and analysis. Two, the ability to be decisive and to see it through. And three, the necessity to have a strategy once that decision is made.
Excellent. And just so for everybody who may not be familiar, or if they've studied this too long ago, could you just remind us of the story of the crossing of the Rubicon? Like, and how much was at stake and how irreversible that decision was?
Basically, Caesar was in the north of Italy with an army, and his time as, commander was set to expire. So he had to return to Rome. And once you crossed this little bridge, this little river, once he crossed the Rubicon, it was essentially a declaration of war. He had, violated his command. He was in treason against the Roman Republic, and it was essentially a move from which there was no turning back. And so to cross the Rubicon essentially meant to declare war against Rome, a war that he eventually won.
Thank you so much. So it's a very powerful thing, because many of us, when faced with these huge decisions, whether it's at work, whether it's in a personal circumstance, there are times where there isn't a gray, it's black and white. You're going to go this way or you're going to go the other way, but there's
Right.
no one way or another. It's irreversible. And I guess what you're saying is, in situations like that, it's super important to be decisive. So pick one and go with it, because it's irreversible anyway. So you got to make that choice. But oftentimes that decisiveness doesn't come from some rash decision. It's actually a lifetime of experience. So
Right.
when you get to that point, you got to combine what your intuition is telling you together with rationally what the situation is. And then finally, it's not enough just to make the decision.
Right.
It's you actually have to have the strategy in place as well, so that once you have crossed the Rubicon, you're executing on something. You're not making it up as you go along. You kind of do actually have a game plan as well.
I think you raised two really important points. One, important decisions, difficult decisions are always in the gray area. There's always, that's why they're momentous, right? That's why they can be lose-lose, right? Instead of win-win or win-lose. You could completely face defeat on all counts. The interesting thing about, I think, the lesson of Caesar is to hedge against that, to create probability, the odds in your favor. You have to become the master of something. If you trust your intuitions without mastery, that's meaningless, right? But if you develop your whole life with a profound knowledge of your market, of your field, of your discipline, that makes the intuition, I was reading, there's this wonderful book, Defense of the Humanities for the Business World by Christian Madsberg, where he talks about, George Soros, before he made his historic bet against the British pound, would have these intuitions, almost physical feelings, this pain telling him to do something. And part of it was this, he knew his subject so thoroughly, so deeply, that it almost becomes operating at a different level, beyond rational, right? But that comes from mastery. And I think the greatest lesson, and I learned this getting my PhD, once you immerse yourself in something and you sacrifice and you learn something thoroughly, the rewards will pay out throughout your life, because you have a claim to something at a level which very few people get to. And I think that's where the valuable intuitions come in.
I love that. Thank you so much. So you also mentioned something closer to home, Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War. Talk about, we have political issues today, but, talk about everything being on the line, the whole unity of the country, and Civil War. How come you refer to this particular tipping point, and what do you think you can learn from it?
It's one of the most extraordinary in American history. There's a wonderful book by Jay Winnick called April 1865, where basically a month where the United States, the Union, after the death of Lincoln, could have split. and it's kind of miraculous that it didn't, if you read this book, all the things that had to happen. But, when Lincoln decides to end slavery, it's a position he gradually came to. He wasn't always as, adamantly anti-slavery as he'd become. He realized that the United States could not continue with the moral evil of slavery, that even if lives had to be, sacrificed, that this was something that you just couldn't have the United States and slavery together. What I think is extraordinary about this decision is it's what I call moral vision. I think most of the successful companies that I've seen and been exposed to somehow have a long-term vision. And all long-term visions in one way or another have to have some sort of ethical or moral clarity, or they'll break down, right? There has to be a vision beneath the profit motive, in my experience. And what Lincoln said basically was, to put this vision into effect, he was willing to make his own compromises. So he worked with his enemies. He created a team out of his enemies, which I think is an unbelievably valuable lesson for leaders, that you don't want to just work with people with the same ideas as you. You have to have enough confidence in yourself and your vision to work with people that don't share your thoughts. The second thing, I think, is that he was able to communicate with honesty with his closest associates and with the American people. We like to think that people can be persuaded, but if you read his second, by, false words and manipulation, but if you read Lincoln's, what I think the greatest speech in American history, his second inaugural address, where he's basically just speaking to the American people about the Civil War and saying neither side has really won this war. Even though the North is going to be the official winner, the losses on both sides have been so devastating. And it's an amazing speech because it's totally devoid of what we're used to, which is political rhetoric. And I think employees completely understand the difference between a leader who's genuinely speaking to them and one who's trying to manipulate them. And I think Lincoln's genius was to see the power of open communication and honesty when the stakes are at their highest. And the last thing I think Lincoln did that I think is amazing, he was willing to accept the blame for his decision. He saw himself as responsible for these deaths, but he said, how will history judge us? In other words, we talk a lot about short-term versus long-term and how hard it is today where everyone wants to see the profits right away. Lincoln said, we're not going to see the short-term profits or the short-term result. We're going to see a long-term one. History will teach us that this was the right decision to end slavery. And of course it has, right? He was putting his decision in the long term. And I think that's something invaluable for every leader.
Bill, just jumping off of that. So when we think about this moral clarity and long-term thinking, there's a lot of challenges because it's kind of one of these things where, well, you might have the very best intentions.
Right.
You're willing to make those sacrifices, in the near term, right? Well, because it's for a greater reason, I'm willing to sacrifice lives, or I'm willing to work with my enemies, or whatever different sacrifices you make. What do you think is like the key point for our audience to take from this? Because I think under normal circumstances, we all want to do the right thing and do the best thing. However, sometimes, we, like when making decisions, you have to constantly balance the short and the long term. So what can we learn from Lincoln when it comes to specifically that, to what extent can you sacrifice certain ideals in the near term to achieve a longer term goal?
Stay offline. I think that you have to, we are so bombarded. I mean, one of the things about the history's tipping points is that these are really clear cases that history has brought to us over centuries or decades. If you're constantly following every development of the news cycle, it's almost impossible to develop a long-term vision. That's why I advocate creating a reading plan instead of a media plan, because to be a leader, to develop a vision, you have to have a kind of inner peace and poise. And it's very hard to do that when you're just bombarded by so much information and so much short-termism. There's a wonderful quote by the great investor, Benjamin Graham, where he says, in the short term, the stock market is a polling machine. like what's hot, what's trendy. In the long term, it's a weighing machine. What's really got fundamental value as a company? And I think the leader has to sift out the noise from knowledge, right? So I think long-term, you always have to deal with short-term things. That's reality, that's managing. But leading has one foot in the short term and one foot in the long term. So how do you keep that one foot in the long term? I think reading great examples of leadership, limiting the amount of information that you process from the media cycle, because its very nature is to keep you pegged to the moment and to not let you think far ahead. And the third thing I would say is develop your own value plan. What are the principles by which you want to rule? Do you want to be considered someone who put his employees, made a point of getting to know his employees, their personal narratives? Do you want to be someone who tried to connect the social mission of your company, align it with a profit motive? All these things, they take work, right? You can't just manufacture them out of the blue. So when you develop your own long-term goals as a leader, I think you naturally start to focus on those things that are going to feed it, rather than the barrage and the cycle that kind of takes you away from it.
Got it. So having this long-term vision, the moral vision,
right,
essentially acts as this incredible anchor or North Star,
right,
that helps you navigate those like very painful short-term management decisions, because you've got this clarity on like, okay, well, here's how we're going to act in the long term, because it's very much anchored into this.
And I'm not advocating, a kind of going into a cave and just completely blocking out the world. Leaders have to deal with a constant flow of everyday decisions, but you have to balance it somehow. And I think that no one's going to say to someone, you need to, we're by nature pegged to short-term decision making. That's what we do all day. The harder point is to carve out the space to articulate that long-term vision. So to develop that vision.
Thank you so much. So you also referred to Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we covered one where it was Caesar in Rome, right? Civil War. Then in the US, closer to home, a whole nation's future at stake. Here we have a situation where literally the entire world is at stake, right? Nuclear fallout could happen if a bad decision is made. What can we learn from this momentous occasion, this incredible critical decisions that needed to be made for our own personal lives?
Yeah, I mean, it was before my time and probably before yours as well, but it's recent enough where it's hard to imagine, there were 80 million missiles pointed at 80 million Americans during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were, not in physical battle, but in ideological battle that could have erupted. And I think we all remember growing up with, the threat of doomsday and talk of bomb shelters and all these things. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, I urge you to, it's a short book, Robert F. Kennedy's 13 Days, where he talks about the 13 days. It's kind of remarkable that we did avoid a nuclear war, and that, Kennedy's decision-making was a huge part of that. How did he do that? If you read that book, you see that he does a couple practical things. Like Lincoln, he assembles the best team. He surrounded himself with he gathered information from the best sources. He had the best diplomats, the best military people, the best political people, people he trusted like his brother. So he had a wonderful team surrounded about him. And yet, this is what I also think is interesting. I think we all suffer a bit from what I call context fallacy. We tend to see things in our own terms. The diplomats wanted a diplomatic solution. The military people wanted a military solution, right? So the great leader has to kind of assemble the best team, but ultimately make the decision on his or her own. And what's really interesting about Kennedy, not only was he willing to do that, the buck was going to stop with him, but he wanted to take responsibility for the mistakes that he made and give praise for the benefits to others. That's a great philosophy. If something goes wrong, say, that person advanced the idea, but I ultimately made the call. And if something goes right, say, she made an amazing suggestion over here. We should really be thanking her. I think this kind of ability to accept blame but give praise is a wonderful gift in a leader. And Kennedy really had that. When the war didn't happen, when the crisis was resolved and people were sort of clapping and saying, you did it, you did. He said, no, I can't take responsibility for this. It's my team, et cetera, et cetera. But when things went wrong during the process, he said, that's on me. And I think people who work for you or who are, under somehow your leadership will really respond to that generosity of taking blame but giving praise. And the third thing that I think that's really extraordinary from this, and as a literature professor, this kind of blew me away, the power of words, the power of communication. He and Khrushchev were going back and forth with these diplomatic messages. And his team wrote up a terrible message that was inflammatory to Khrushchev. And it had gotten there. We could have gotten into war, basically. Kennedy took the missive and with his brother and his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, rewrote it in a completely new conciliatory way. And it was part of the process of negotiating a détente. The power of words. I think every leader has to realize what they say to the people that work for them is so important. And to find a way to kind of, for the right words is just so essential. And in fact, Kennedy talked about the reading that helped him during this process. This goes back to your earlier question about how do we develop a long-term vision. He had been reading Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, this wonderful book about how World War I started. And if you think about it, World War I was kind of the end of Europe's supremacy, political supremacy, because not long after that came World War II. And, it ended the idea of Europe as we know it. This book describes a comedy, a tragic comedy of errors that precipitated people into, total war, World War I. And Kennedy said, we are not going to reproduce that here. So reading, looking to the past is essential in making this kind of decision. And Kennedy's an example of that.
Can you help us zoom in on the very specific critical points of the decision that was made in the Cuban Missile Crisis and how these different strategies actually played out? Specifically, what I find most interesting with leadership is that, if you have all these like incredibly smart people around you,
right.
They're smart in different ways, have different areas of expertise. They're all saying different things, but the buck stops with you. And it's
right.
said at the beginning, it's very gray, right?
Right.
Like if it was obvious, you just make the decision, move on. When it's very gray. So how did he very specifically from a human perspective deal with making the decision? Because ultimately, nobody knows what the exact right outcome,
right.
like what the outcome will be. It's hard to predict. What do you think? Like, could you tell us a little bit about
Sure.
like, when it came to the decision point? What his team advised him, and what he did to the contrary?
Well, in terms of what his team advised him, as I said, it's the contextual fallacy, and this is why I think interdisciplinary thinking is so important, to step outside our boxes. We all have ways of thinking that we're it's the flip side of mastery. You do something for so long, you start to see the world through that lens. Mastery is good, but being a prisoner to that way of thinking is not good, right? So each side, as I said, the military people were pushing a kind of military solution. The diplomatic people wanted more negotiations. Each kind of element of his team was pushing their agenda. What's interesting is that each side, Russia, the Soviet Union and the United States, had a non-negotiable point. For Kennedy, the non-negotiable point was that the missiles had to be removed. You could not build these missiles off the American shore. It was just, that was non-negotiable. And for the Soviet Union, who had just, remember in World War II, they had lost 20 million people. They had experienced the incredible devastation of war firsthand just a generation or two earlier. They were worried of a kind of military presence of the United States, a retaliation in their, region of the world. When Kennedy assured Khrushchev that there would be no buildup by the Americans in Eastern Europe, that this was not about, a kind of the precipitation towards war, that this was just, if you remove these missiles, we in good faith will work with you toward peace. I think when both he and Kennedy understood that, the rest of the negotiation was possible, that there would be no escalation. But so Kennedy had to somehow establish that red line. You cannot have this presence here, while assuring him that if that were done in good faith, he in good faith would not put military pressure on Khrushchev. And I think once they knew that, I think at a certain point, if you read and you can find all the correspondence online, it's all public information. At a certain point, things were going very badly during the negotiations. Both sides realized that the burden of atomic war was close to being on their shoulders. And at the 11th hour, they backed away. But if they hadn't coolly negotiated that, those boundary areas, it's hard to say what would have happened.
I love that. So making clear what your red lines are and being very firm about them, but then being extremely conciliatory and like solution oriented within the bounds that are set within that.
I think it's good faith negotiation. Good faith negotiation. Just like honesty and communication, people can smell it. I really believe that. I mean, think about it. We're bombarded all day long with offers to buy this, that you've developed a filter. And I think that, especially savvy negotiators really have a sixth sense for this, for when one is negotiating in good faith.
Very good. You mentioned something that I'm going to ask my last question on, at least for now.
Sure.
And we'll switch to the audience questions. So everybody who's listening, I highly encourage you to ask any questions that you have into the Q&A box. That's at the bottom, at the center bottom of the screen. So feel free to put your questions there and we'll get to them in turn. You mentioned something, Joseph, about, you have this lifetime of experience that helps you make decisions a certain way, surround yourself with great people, all these things. But then in the story of Kennedy, also you mentioned, he read a lot of books.
Yes.
Right? And I'm sure also in the case of Lincoln and Caesar, these people weren't just very experienced in their own lives and the things they faced, but they drew on the stories from history. So for everybody who's listening here, what would be your recommended, like a quick recommended reading list? What do you think are some of the most critical works to read, especially when it comes to key decision-making strategies? Like what works from history do you think inspired, not only that our audience should read, but that historical figures across time has kind of kept on looking back to inspire their decision-making in the right way?
That's such a great question. And it's one I get all the time and I think about all the time. The way I look at it is this. I look at it in two ways. One, there are certain works, no question. You can read Machiavelli's Prince. People think of The Prince as this book about realpolitik and this ruthlessness. It's so much more than that. It's really one of the greatest works of organizational psychology ever written. It's how people think within organization, with not just within organizations, but within the power structure. And, has that famous chapter, is it better for a leader or a prince to be loved or feared, right? And, I've done workshops where we've spent an hour on that and people come on both sides of it. And, how do you become both loved and feared? Or really what he's talking about is how do you become respected and admired, which is a fusion of the two. There's that, there's, Plato's defense, Plato's Apology, which is essentially Socrates' last words before he's executed by the Athenians, where he lays out his long-term vision. Why, even though he goes to death willingly and without fear, because his body can die, but his ideals will never die, right? And so he says, what is there to fear when you have articulated the principles by which you live, where you can look yourself in the eye and say, this has been a good life. I can definitely recommend those. You know, there's wonderful, this Lincoln's second inaugural address in the midst of the American Civil War crisis is a great work. Martin Luther King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail is a remarkable text about civil disobedience. There's so many different wonderful short pieces, long pieces that one can read. But what I really think is important is for you and everyone else to create their own essential library of these works. You know, I have this thing what I call the rule of fours, how to make reading a part of your everyday life. I think it should be like exercise, something you do 4 or 5 days a week for an hour. My rule of fours is read 4 days a week for 45 minutes at a time, and read 4 different categories. You know, read contemporary fiction, read nonfiction, read a genre that you love, mystery, science fiction, nature writing, whatever. Reading should also, you know, should be fun. Shouldn't be like just a steamed broccoli diet. And then the fourth one is read a classic. You know, read the Herodotus's histories or Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, the books that have stood the test of time. If you read all 4 of these genres, if you make reading an everyday part of your life, the riches will be indescribable. And in terms of leadership, you know, there are books that are, as I created my program, what I started to worry about was like, okay, I'm not a business school professor. I'm not working in a corporation. What can I teach on leadership? And I realized something, as we discussed earlier, leadership is part of everyone's life, not just captains of industry, not just people who run, you know, political leaders. Family, you know, whether you're in a family, in a friendship, a small business, a startup, you have to make leadership decisions at every point. And I think there's this amazing reservoir of leadership examples in the great writings of the past.
I love that. Could you repeat the 4 categories again?
Yeah, the 4 categories are, I choose them. Contemporary fiction, who are the writers today making great, you know, writing new stuff, the new voices today that we should keep an eye to. Nonfiction, something about the world that interests you. You know, literature isn't just the make-believe, it's also people who are essayists, economists, politicians. The third category is the genre that you love. What you know, your version of your favorite Netflix series in a book. Like, you shouldn't stop reading those. Reading should be an act of love. In that genre that you love is your home. And the fourth category is the classic, right? That book that you've been meaning to get to. I think that if you read these other genres, especially your favorite one, that makes the classic more manageable, because these books are very demanding. Barry, by the way, reading is on the decline. Reading is down like 30% the last decade. The Washington Post did a study. And I think it's because it's harder. Reading demands total focus and concentration. And as our direction is pulled in so many different ways by social media, I think it's becoming harder to do, but I also think it's an even more valuable resource that companies will want people with the ability to focus, with the ability to tune out the noise, and with the ability to separate knowledge from just information.
I love that. Thank you so much, Joseph. I took the notes and pasted it here too for people to kind of keep in mind the rule of fours. And I myself personally have been, I grew up reading a ton, and then it declined, unfortunately. And now every day, at least 20 to 30 minutes at night and 20 to 30 minutes in the morning, I read, and it gives me this almost defensive shield against the things that are going on day to day by helping me think bigger. So I want to jump into the audience question now.
Sure.
So our first question, I'm going to be, if you ask the question, I'm going to be tuning you in so you can ask your own question. So we're going to go to Shelby. If you could unmute yourself, please, and ask the question that you had.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so my question was, I feel that, you know, in general, it feels that war gets recorded a lot, like how some war happened and what led up to it. But the avoidance of war doesn't get recorded as much. So in my thought, like, it leads me to think that we're not storing enough strategies of maintaining peace. And I was just curious what your thoughts were on that.
It's a wonderful point. When we look at consequential decisions in business, as we said, they often involve money, and politics, they often involve war, questions of life or death. But how do you create peace? I think that gets back to our earlier point about developing a clear moral vision for your job, for your company, for your profession. Obviously, your intent in developing that vision is to avoid war-like situations, to avoid conflict, to avoid destruction, to create harmonious path, right? So the really good leaders are able to take from the great thinkers that vision for peaceful growth and a general kind of functioning, a high level of functioning within the organization. So in a way, by developing that long-term vision, you're avoiding those instances of war. Those, crises will always arise. There's nothing we can do about that. But how do you mitigate against that? How do you sort of create the conditions by which that is less likely to occur? And I think, developing that long-term moral vision, that ethical vision, your principles, right, can work in that favor.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Thank you, Shalvi, for that great question. All right, so we've got another question. This is actually a question about a decision. So Kushbu,
Okay.
I'm gonna tune you in now, 1 second. And Joseph, I think your microphone might be rubbing against your shirt.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay.
No, it's all good. All right, Kushbu, we are ready for you.
Hi,
Hi.
I was actually asking about how did you figure out which area to take your dissertation in?
Okay.
Because I'm actually writing my dissertation on leadership.
Wow.
But there's just
Okay.
so many things that interest me that it's been really challenging figuring out like which direction to run.
Yes.
And how to just kind of stay focused. And I'm reading a lot, so I was really happy to hear you say that we should read more. I have a bookshelf that's breaking, and I'm just reading all day long.
Okay, that's a great question.
Before you dive in, Joseph, just
Yeah.
also, it would be great if you could answer this question using a framework that of decision making, like based on what we already discussed.
Right.
Everybody can think about it in the perspective of like, okay, if I have a huge decision to make, like, what dissertation to focus on, what your thesis should be, or it could be for somebody else, what company to start and so forth. So in this kind of context of what Kushbu asked, what's a framework of how to approach this decision?
Yep.
And then we can focus in on like specifics of a dissertation as well.
Okay, I think that's great. Thank you, Barry, for asking me to elaborate a framework, because I think it's a great test case. Having written a dissertation, I'm qualified to answer this through firsthand experience. And the first thing I would say, the approach. The approach is, and we get back to Kennedy, we get back to Khrushchev here. What's the end game? The end game for those two was avoid nuclear war, right? I mean, a very serious end game. For Lincoln, it's keep the Union together, okay? For Kennedy and Khrushchev, it's avoid nuclear war. For you, it's complete the dissertation. Now, that's not as obvious as it sounds. There's a difference between completing a dissertation and a book. I remember in graduate school, we had an expression, the best dissertation is a done dissertation. What does that mean? Unlike a book, which you have to kind of send into the world and which will get reviewed and people will buy or sell, the dissertation certainly will be evaluated, but it's usually not the last word on the subject. It still is part of training. In other words, I've seen brilliant people in graduate school who could not finish their dissertation. And so they were trying to create this amazing work of art, of writing, where really what they should have focused on was doing the best possible job they could within a circumscribed framework, and then letting it go and knowing that you go back to it. So I would say your end game is to finish the dissertation, not to write the perfect dissertation. I hope that makes sense, that distinction. Second is, a strategy for doing that. What's your strategy, right? For Kennedy, it was to change the rhetoric and communication with Khrushchev and adopt a new one, right? For Caesar, when he crossed the Rubicon, it was to strike swiftly through military campaigns to all the weak points in his opponent. For you, I think, you mentioned that you were reading a lot. I think that's great, but I would also be careful. You also need to balance reading with writing. By that, I mean, sometimes the urge to compile too many notes can almost become a burden. And if we just say, okay, I want to now start writing it, and I think we can get to that by addressing something you said. You said there's so much great stuff on leadership. It's true. I think the best dissertations have a real focus, that you choose something specific, even kind of laser-like, and go deep into it. When you write your book, you'll expand, you'll kind of make it a little more open, but the dissertation is this kind of scientific approach to something very specific. And then you get to the execution, which is, I would force myself to write X amount of time every day, X amount of days a week. Even when the muse isn't there, just to that end game of finishing. And I think you'll see that you'll develop a rhythm that will make the work go faster than you had anticipated. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joseph. That was excellent. So I just noted down here, have an endpoint in mind, create a strategy, and then, get a good cadence and keep it going. Love that. I think it applies to everything, every key decision. Before we go to the next question, I'm not sure why, but this hasn't happened before. There's some interference on your side. I don't know, maybe it's on your phone, but I'll let you know if it continues.
I don't hear anything. Do you hear it now, the interference?
A little bit.
Okay.
But let's continue. Hopefully it will be better now. Just quickly, two people had questions very quickly about the books that you mentioned. So there was, Sibel asked about what was the very first book you mentioned about organizational development?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would definitely read Machiavelli's Prince. It's on the psychology of power, and it's a brilliant inquiry into the way organizational psychology works.
Got it. Thank you. And then the first, we also had a question from Alpi. What was the name and author of the book, Defense of Humanity?
Defense of Humanity. Do you remember what context that was in, Beri?
I'm not sure, but OP, if you have more context, please let us know. But yeah, we'll come back to it. Joseph, just question. So here you mentioned about the importance of writing briefly when you were answering the last question. Can you elaborate a little bit more? And also how this can help with decision-making specifically. So one talk that we hosted recently was called How to Think Like Amazon, How to Think and Scale Like Amazon. One of the things that they do at Amazon is, if you're pitching a new product or a new strategy, you write a press release from a year in the future, looking back and explaining why this was such a success, but also what challenges you overcame. What other kind of writing exercises to or help organize one's thoughts can people do? Some people think on Excel, some on PowerPoint, some actually write documents. Just curious, especially from leaders in history, what kind of role did writing and organizing information have when it comes to making good decisions?
I think it's a great question. And I think that gets to what we were discussing earlier. To me, a reading plan and a writing plan are one and the same thing, because they're both ways in which you step outside the kind of the social media information economy and enter the knowledge space, right? Whether you're reading, one way of taking in ideas of the past, another way is through writing. And I think the extraordinary thing about writing is this: writing is strategy and execution. We all have great ideas. As someone once said to me, you can't patent an idea, really. You can patent a technology, but ideas, you got to do something with it. And the amazing thing about writing, whether, and I like what you said, it could be PowerPoint, it could be Excel, it could be literally writing a document. You take something that exists in an idea that's untested, and then you sort of, you subject it to the litmus test of reality. That Amazon model is absolutely brilliant because it's almost like you're projecting forward what this will be. And once you do that, you realize, well, it may not be such a good idea after all. Because I think it brings us to the really important issue here. All ideas that we have feel good, sometimes even brilliant, right? The reality is 99 out of 100 of them might not work. The great creative, innovative people are all good at one thing, and that's failure. They have the courage to fail and the willingness to fail. The willingness to know that not all their ideas will work. So what I recommend is, I would say, create a reading plan and create what I call a reader's diary. Write your responses to the work. What in the work resonates with you as a reader, but also as a person, as a employee, as a CEO, as an entrepreneur? What are you finding in this book? I always tell my students, write in the margins of your book. That's your diary of this class, right? For those of us who are no longer studying in schools or college, university, whatnot, keeping that reader's diary, that's your engagement with the work. And it's an amazing thing. It's a record of your experience of reading, but it also gives you a way to go back to it and see how you can leverage off it in the future for, you know, especially at work, to kind of put these ideas into action. I think it's an extraordinary tool. And the reality is, not a lot of people write. It's hard. The one thing all these things have in common that people are doing less and less of, they're difficult. It's hard to concentrate. As you said you read every day. I'm sure in the beginning it took some sort of time to get your concentration up, and now it's up and ready, just like an athlete who trains. The same thing with writing. You know, the more you write, the better you get at it. And an amazing thing, you mentioned some of these people who were great readers, Lincoln, Caesar, they all had something else in common. They were great writers. Julius Caesar is one of the greatest authors in Latin literature. Lincoln is one of the, you know, as Obama says, he considers Lincoln's speeches literature. That didn't happen overnight. They developed their skill over time. And the power to use language well, we saw it work in leadership through Kennedy, you know, directly. But I also think it has indirect benefits as well, because when you're writing, you're distilling your thoughts and separating the ephemeral ones from the ones that you want to last. So I think it's a great tool, great tool.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of two Napoleon quotes. One, I think he said something along the lines of, reading without writing is daydreaming. And then he said another one, which you'll like, is, show me a family of readers and I will show you the people who move the world. So
wow,
it goes to both of your points there. One other great piece of advice I heard that's been useful for me is that we all go into so many meetings. We all, you know, learn in so many different ways. We read so many things. This advice was, instead of taking a ton of notes, sometimes if after every meeting or after you read any one thing, if you just write down one sentence with your key takeaway, just the one thing you want to remember. And obviously, if we could remember one sentence from every lecture we ever went to or every book we ever read, it would be incredible. So there's something very powerful about that as well. Joseph, as we're getting to our last couple minutes here, what I'd love to also ask you about is you mentioned Machiavelli, okay? And this I think is really good, because a really good thing to focus on, because many of us, we talked about it a little bit with Lincoln, right? We want to make the right decisions. We want to do good things, but we're dealing with humans. We're not dealing with angels, right? And human beings, even with good intentions, sometimes if people feel like they can take advantage of you, they'll do it because, you know, it's business. Like, everyone's trying to get the best for themselves. While of course, you know, it's also critical to have that long-term vision. Just want you to really share with us if there's any, like in a nutshell, anything that we can learn from Machiavelli, from what he was saying in terms of when it comes to balancing, you know, how to be shrewd with how to also have this like longer term integrity so that people trust you in the first place. Any key lessons you could share from that before we wrap up?
Absolutely. You know, I think this is a great topic to wrap up in. Of course, people are people. We don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in a fairy tale, a utopia where we just have beautiful visions of the future and people fall in line. I actually think practically it makes sense for a company, for an organization, for a team to have a clear moral vision, a clear ethical stance. Even, as I said, for long-term functioning, and this is why. Think of Machiavelli. Machiavelli says, you know, there's a couple different kinds of leaders. He says, there's the leader that people love, right? The popular person, the popular man, the popular woman who, you know, needs that affection, who needs that sort of adulation, and who's very generous, who, you know, remembers people's birthdays, who signs off on bonuses and just wants to keep people happy because he wants to be loved or she wants to be loved. And Machiavelli says, certainly there's a virtue for that. You know, we want to like our leaders. But he said, if we had to choose between being loved or feared, it's better to be feared. Why? Because if you fear a leader, if you love someone, he says, this is why I think Machiavelli is so interesting, to your point. People aren't angels. People think in the short term. They know that if someone loves them, they're happy to love them back as long as the going's good. But when the going gets tough and a difficult decision needs to be made, they're more likely to double cross the person who wants to be loved than the person they fear. Because the person they fear can take retribution against them, right? Could fire them, could give them a bad job, could, you know, sue them, something. So that you don't, you know, if you have to be loved or feared, it's actually a little better to be feared. That's Machiavelli's position, okay? Now here's what gets interesting. He says the one thing you don't want to be is hated. If you're hated, people will take action against you. They will quit. They will, whatever. They will, in wars, they'll get violent against you. The hated leader is different than the feared / respected leader, because hatred pushes people to take risks, just like, you know, that they normally wouldn't take because they don't want to work with someone who they find distasteful, who they find loathsome. So love is good to a certain point, but if you have to choose between love and fear, fear is better. Hated is what you don't want. What do you want? And I think this speaks to your point. You want to be a fusion of loved and feared, which is respected. And I think this gets to your point. People need to know that what counts at the end of the day isn't that you're their buddy, you're their confidant, you're their cheerleader, but that you are running the ship with their best interests in mind. And that you don't have to be the most likable person, you don't have to be the funniest person, the best dressed person, but you're a good leader. And what's amazing to me about leadership is just its incredible diversity. As we said earlier, they come in all types, great leaders. What Jim Collins calls that level 5 leader, right? Can be quiet, can be eloquent, can be vocal, can be, you know, cerebral, can be instinctive. There's no formula. That's the genius of this. But they all find a way to somehow distill the interests of the organizations to its essence and act on it. And if I may, I'd like to close why I think reading plays a role in that. I think all great leaders and all great leaders have 3 things in common. 1, humility. Every time you open a book, you're saying, I have something to learn from that book that I don't already know. I don't know everything. The world is still a mystery to me. Leaders are the same way. When you're a great leader, you get to know your people working for you. They know you're not a means to an end. You have the humility to understand the people that are working for you. 2, collaboration. Every great reader is saying, because I don't know everything, I need all the help I can get. So I'm going to read, you know, Plato's defense of, that was the second book for your earlier caller, Plato's defense of Socrates for ideals on how to build the ethical life. I'm going to read Machiavelli to understand the machinations of power. I'm a natural collaborator. Just like the great leader knows that he's only as good or she's only as good as the people who work for him or her, and that ceaselessly tries to collaborate. And third and most important, I think reading gives you perspective. When you read, you're literally walking in someone else's shoes. You're seeing the world through their eyes. You know, I don't know if you've read To Kill a Mockingbird, but the last scene, the young character, Scout, stands on Boo Radley's porch, this character that she's been frightened of her whole book, and he saves her life when Bob Ewell attacks her. And it's like Scout is looking on his porch, and it's as though she's got Boo's eyes on for the first time, seeing the world. And that's what reading does every time we open a book. We see the world through someone else's eyes. And that's what great leaders have this gift of doing. They can somehow intuit the world through the eyes of the people that work for them. And that's why I think reading and leading go hand in hand.
Absolutely. That was incredibly inspiring. Both your final thoughts there, as well as the whole conversation. I think it's incredibly important to reflect on these tipping points in history and also get perspective from great works of literature, just like all great leaders have done in the past. So can't thank you enough, Joseph, for being a part of this conversation, for inspiring us to make better decisions, and excited to host a lot more events with you and support you on your journey. Thank you for everything.
Thank you. And I'd love, you know, if anyone in the audience wants to be in touch, my website is josephluzi.com, and I'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation. Thank you so much, Beri, for this.
Thank you, Joseph. And thank you, everybody, for dialing in. Until next time.